We can't be sure. Maybe this is all deception. But it looks like the Americans backed down. They had their ultimatums. There were the three, demands of the Iranians. First, of course, zero enrichment. Second, was, no missiles or a greatly restricted missile arsenal. And the third was no support for their allies in the region. And, apparently, and there were going to be talks about this in Istanbul, Turkey, as we were mentioning last time. Now, there was some report, I think it came out in Axios, that is from some U.S. official. And he said, well, we told the Iranians it's this or it's nothing. And the Iranians said, okay, then nothing. And and then Reuters reported again from some U.S. official. It says that we didn't expect the Iranians to say that, but apparently they did, and which doesn't surprise us. And the Americans backed down and said, okay, we'll have talks about your nuclear program in Oman, like we did before. And those talks were held today, as a matter of fact, of the first round of those talks. And apparently they haven't gotten into anything, of substance yet. Today it was just talking about how to, what the, let's say, parameters are going to be for these talks and, what the format is going to be. So as some people have described them, is negotiations about negotiations, very preliminary. But apparently, they went well enough. And there were going to be further rounds in these talks in Oman.
Well, it sounds kind of like a repeat of what happened before the 12-Day War, right? Because at first, they were negotiating, the Witkoff and Arachi, they're saying, yeah, we're making some progress. And then all of a sudden it became very maximalist, and then it stalled. And so I'm wondering, is the same thing going to happen here? Like, it sounds like Trump, if he can get a JCPOA 2.0 and call it a win, he would love to do that. But the big question is whether or not Israel or Netanyahu will allow him to do that, and if they're the ones really in charge.
Right. And Israel has been saying, at least, we've getting reports from Israeli media that the Israelis are emphatic that, no, this is not acceptable. You cannot talk about the nuclear program in this way. The Israelis say, it's just like now it's all about the missiles above all. And if they don't restrict their missiles, then we reserve the right to attack Iran. And according to, again, Israeli media, back in December, Netanyahu got that agreement and approval for such an attack from Trump, which is probably true, right? You remember the trip Netanyahu made to the Washington, D.C. back then. If so, it just shows, I think, the other, maybe like you're saying, this is perhaps, and I was suggesting at the beginning too, that this is maybe all a cover for a surprise attack that's coming. If so, the Iranians are not letting their guard down. They're saying that we're prepared for attack at any moment. We're in a high state of readiness. So I don't think that it's going to work in that way. But maybe it's real. If it's real that they actually, like the reports from Axios and Reuters strongly indicate, then it just shows tremendous incompetence. It's just like, we knew that the Iranians were going to say no, or we pretty much knew they were going to say no. That's not something that they were going to accept. The fact that the Americans were surprised just shows how ignorant they are, about Iran. And then the fact that now they think, okay, now we'll just have talks about the nuclear program. Maybe we'll go for the JCPOA, the big guy, Trump. He says we can do that, but Trump already made this promise to Netanyahu, right? So I think that just it could be just pure incompetence and chaos. We've seen similar things in the so-called negotiations about the Ukraine war. Where the Americans make a promise to the Russians, and then they go off and start talking to the Europeans and start working out something that completely, violates that agreement that they had made with the Russians. And, that doesn't work. That's not the way you negotiate. But that, again, I think as the problem begins at the top, I think, with Trump. But then Witkoff, everybody says he's a smart guy, and I believe he probably is quite a smart guy. But he's just terribly, well, green, he just doesn't have any diplomatic experience there, training or even, knowledge of these countries. He doesn't have expert teams with them, it appears. So he's incompetent. He's really out of his depth. And,
well, he's also just a hardcore Zionist. He's not a impartial negotiator at all. And Kushner is supposed to be tagging along on these negotiations, right?
Right.
So
yeah,
it's just like how these aren't parties that you can really seek a deal with. They are aligned with Netanyahu. We know Kushner's him and his family are like best friends with Benjamin Netanyahu's family, and there's that Epstein link as well that said Kushner is the real brains behind the whole operations. That this whole thing was Trump is compromised by Israel and Kushner is the brains. Who knows if that's true, but it feels right.
It could be, yeah,
right. And so, well, we talk about this incompetence. I'm sure it's bereft throughout the Trump administration, but do you think that what that is leading to is that they're just sort of individual factions within the government that are kind of doing their own thing? Like you said, one side talks to Putin and negotiations one thing, and the other talks to the Europeans and then negotiates something else. And then when it comes to Iran and Israel, was this, for example, like this leak of the 3 million Epstein files, was this somebody within the administration that is aware of the dangers or who knows, maybe it was Netanyahu that had it released, but I'm just wondering, is there somebody that we can support within the government? Is there a faction that's fighting on our side that's saying this is insane?
Right. Well, first of all, I don't think it wasn't a leak, is my understanding. It was, a decision made by the Department of Justice.
Yeah, well, I'm so kind of confused about that as well, because didn't they release it and then the page went 404 shortly thereafter? It's like maybe I'm kind of confused, and it's kind of strange how some things were shown and other things were redacted, and it was a bit odd. I don't know if we really know.
Well, I think again we may be looking at a lot of incompetence. I mean, this is a problem with the Trump administration. Part of it is understandable. Okay, that he's coming in with some objectives that contradict again the deep state. Again the permanent bureaucracy. They've been doing things one way for decades, and in some cases he actually does want to do something different. And then so you say, well, who can I work with? Because these guys are all going to try to undermine me. So he goes over their heads and finds completely fresh people. The problem is the lack of experience. And so it's sort of, and then, but I think part of it is also just Trump himself. He's inconsistent. It seems like he forgets what he says from day to day. He says stuff that just isn't true and seems to believe in it. An example of that may have been his statement the other day about the week-long energy truce. There are different theories about what that was all about. The Russians seem to be really annoyed by it. One theory which Alexander Mercouris puts forth, and may very well be true, it's very sensible, is that they had an agreement, but it was kept secret. And then Trump blabbed, and that annoyed the Russians. And that could be true. Another is just that Trump made it up. Like he's made statements about Modi told me this, or we had this talk. And Modi said, no, I didn't talk to him last week. I don't know what he's talking about. So he may have just said this. That's very believable. And then the Russians, were annoyed, like, what's he talking about? And then they decided to say, oh, okay. After a day or two of silence, they went ahead and said, kind of played along with it, said very little about it, but just said, okay, it's ending tomorrow or 2 days from now. Because essentially they had a big strike, I think, planned on Monday, the day after it ended. But anyway, it just shows that Trump himself is chaotic. And, you were talking about different factions, for example, with regard to the negotiations between Russia and the West. But these are the same people. I mean, you're talking about Steve Witkoff going and talking to Putin and then going off and talking to the Europeans and abandoning all his positions and talking about security guarantees, then going back to the Russians and say, oh, yeah, we can't have security guarantees. We promise that to you. Yeah. So again, I think it shows real incompetence. Sure, there are going to be factions. I think there always are. But I think much of this is just explained by just pure, inexperience. and incompetence.
Yeah, but settling a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine and a larger security architecture with NATO and Russia, that's complicated. That's difficult. We knew that was always going to be difficult. The Iran nuclear deal should be easy because Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon. The U.S. doesn't want them to have a nuclear weapon. This should be piece of cake.
They did it before.
You already had the agreement, right? And they could do it again. So it's different. There's something else going on here, and obviously we know what it is. And so there's always that question: does the tail wag the dog, or does the dog wag the tail?
Well, again, we'll see if Obama did carry through that deal with opposition from Israel. So it's an example of where the dog managed to get the bone, if you want to extend the metaphor or whatever. I don't know if that works, but. But then, they got their revenge later, when Trump took office and he tore it up. Now they have Trump and they have, as you pointed, Witkoff and Jared Kushner, very much, Zionist allied with Netanyahu. And they have reports that Netanyahu saying that no way. So it doesn't look, it's again a deal that could be done, but because of that influence from the Israeli government, which is more than influence. It's just like they have their own people right there in the negotiating team. It looks highly unlikely. It would take a real firm commitment from Trump to get it done. And probably the first thing he should do is to remove Witkoff and definitely Kushner.
Yeah.
And I don't think he's going to do that.
I think the problem with Trump and why he's been such a disappointment to so many people is that he's proven to be very, he might just, won't even touch the Epstein stuff and being compromised, but just his personality, and he seems to be very weak and open to and vulnerable to manipulation. He seems to be very vulnerable to that. He doesn't seem to be able to really kind of stick to his guns and understand. I actually even recognize this when I remember watching The Apprentice with my buddies back in Shanghai in the day. I remember there was, I think it was this guy, Gary Busey, that seemed to be clearly pretty insane on this Celebrity Apprentice season. And I was like, and Trump was like, that guy might be, I believe that guy's got something going on. He's smart. I can see it. I was like, I can clearly see that this guy's crazy. And then it, it fell apart later on with I don't remember exactly how the show went, but I just remember that judgment call. I'm like, he really fell for this, he fell for this, this act, and I don't know. Of course, that's a reality show. Maybe the whole thing was an act and I fell for the whole thing. But anyways, I think that is the main problem, that maybe, like we say, Trump maybe doesn't want it, but you can just see him when he's being attacked by Zionist reporters and media and influencers around him, how he just kind of caves.
Yeah. No, he does. I think that's true. That's something I've heard from his first term in office. It was often said that he just believed, if you want to know what his position, find out who he talked to 15 minutes earlier.
Right. So we'll see. Well, something I want to go back. You mentioned that regarding that Israel was wanting to focus on the ballistic missile program. They said as long as they have these ballistic missiles, then we have reserved the right to attack Iran. If that's the case, if Israel wants that position, fine, you do it. It doesn't involve us, right? If you choose to attack, that's on you. If you're worried that Iran's going to has these missiles, then don't attack them so they don't use them on you. Iran is not the one that we've seen take, preemptive strikes. It's you that took preemptive strikes on Iran. So what's the problem here? Just don't do it, Israel. Don't attack them,
Yeah, right. Well, again, there's that obsession they have with Iran, and especially Netanyahu. He's got to destroy him. And I think they assume that in the end, the U.S. will not just leave them to their own device. If they launch an attack, they get in trouble. The 800-pound gorilla, the U.S., will climb into the ring and start fighting on their behalf. And I think that's a gamble. It's not really even much of a gamble. I think it's a pretty safe assumption on their part. It shouldn't be that way. The U.S. should send, real clear message. Don't do this. If you do it, you're on your own, but they're not going to do that. And even if they say it, the Israelis are not going to believe it. And they're probably going to be right not to believe it.
Yeah, so I don't think these negotiations will go anywhere. It might buy both sides a little bit of time while they
Right.
prepare. That's how I'm reading it. Is that how you're reading it? That we are
Yeah.
headed to war, right?
Yeah. Again, because of those reports from Axios and Reuters, this suggests to me that, yeah, there's a chance again, like we were saying earlier, that Trump is looking for an off ramp, but I don't think he's going to find it here again because of the people that he's got in his negotiating team. Whatever, it's not going to work. He's got himself into a fix. And he's probably not going to get out. And in the end, there's going to be some kind of strike. Again, there are reports, I think I heard this from Alistair Crook, who's very well informed about the region, said that the Americans actually proposed, a symbolic strike and then a symbolic retaliation, and then we'll call it quits, which is, we've seen similar things in the past. And the Iranians said no.
Not
It's
this
just
time.
like, okay, because in fact, we've done that but then you keep on coming back and attacking us again. So what's the point, right?